All right, guys, I am here with Mr. Bright and Step, who I believe you are working on a proposed change list for Singe, and just for the video, I will show the change list here. It is it's like a list of Singe changes. We have a lower health growth level by 3, some higher attack speed level 1. The biggest change would probably be Q granting kill credit against affected minions if they're about to die to other minions, meaning like if you're in the middle of a wave and you have poison on it, you won't get KS'd by your own minions, essentially. And then we have a slight nerf to the EAP ratio by 5%. And then you had a list of questions for me, I believe, so I'll go ahead and pull that up as well. And then I think before we get to that, I would probably want to ask you, are these confirmed, or is there like we're just doing like kind of, or are we doing like, what do you call it, routine work on champions overall, or...
So let me like sort of set the stage here.
Sure.
I actually am not one of the designers on the live pod. So the live pod is normally the people who would do these kinds of things. I'm on the seasonal pod, so that's the people who are doing things usually like preseason level type stuff, right? So for example, I made feats of strength.
Okay.
This is something that, among other things, I work on stuff in my free time, and this was something that was originally just kind of an opportunistic, hey, can we make improvements here? People do these kinds of things all the time internally. A lot of them don't ship. This one's going to the PBE, and as of right now, I think we've been actually pretty happy with this one in particular internally, and so it's pretty likely to ship. It's possible we may want to make a couple of changes before it ships, but as of right now, it's pretty likely that we'll want to ship it, at least something pretty close to this, in the next patch.
Okay,
and cool, that's why they're on the PBE.
All right. So I guess my first question before I get into your list of questions would be, was Singe like kind of singled out for being unsatisfying in the early game, or is that just something that you guys kind of doing like a whole pass over, like a bigger list of champions with?
So in this case, it was a combination of a few things. To tell you the truth, originally this started with a more out there experiment. I was trying some more out there stuff, including some things like Singe Jungle, and seeing like, hey, is that cool? Is that interesting for people? And this list kind of came up as a part of, hey, a lot of the stuff I was doing just like clearly wasn't working out, or had some clear downsides, and we weren't.
Are you allowed to talk about some of that stuff, or?
I could talk. I think about the jungle stuff in particular was like. The problem ended up being that I felt like it was pretty functional, and actually it turns out that Singe Jungle is less bad than I thought. Like I didn't actually have to buff the clear by that much before it was actually pretty clearly solid, and pretty functional. The concern was mainly that, kind of similar to other like run at you in a straight line type junglers, you think of like your Ramesses and your Hecarim type champions. The core problem that we ran into with Singe, or the core concern, was, hey, the counterplay to this is a bit lacking comparatively to other champions like Nunu or Rammus or whatever, because those other champions that run at you in a straight line or snowball at you, at whatever the case might be, if you hit them with a ranged CC of some kind to slow, your Lux Qs, your Luxie, whatever the case might be,
sure.
It's over for them, right? Like they kind of stop because all their CC is melee range, right? The core concern with Singe, is that Singe throws his goop on you, right? It doesn't actually matter at that point if you CC the Singed, because at that point, okay, you're grounded, you're slowed, their laner can catch up to you, and then there were a lot of concerns around the counterplay there, and so we kind of shifted away from the alternate role stuff that I was experimenting with, which initially, like I was, when I put it in, I wasn't saying like, oh, this is for sure great, like it was an experiment, right? We do those, and moved more towards the, hey, can we improve Singed for new potential players who might like Singed, but might get pushed away from him by having some of these really frustrating experiences. And also, hey, what about the core Singed?
I was gonna comment on that a little bit, but sorry, keep going.
And also, like, what about the core Singed players who would like to lane in some of these matchups, but feel like they actually can't because they just can't last hit, right? And so originally, I don't know how familiar you are with some of the executes we have on other dot effects, but I tried other executes similar to what we have on Rumble and on Malzahar's. These are actually different kinds. We have a variety of these different kinds. Like they're just kind of unique per champion. And I'm making this worse, right? But this is another completely unique type of execute that we have. Rumble's it checks if the next tick of damage from the Q would kill the minion.
Okay.
And if it does, it says, okay, it's dead. You just kill it.
Okay.
Malzahar has a level scaling damage with an AP ratio, I believe. So like a whole, unique set of mechanics. It's all for him. Like it's all special. Like, hey, if it's below this threshold, just kill it.
Okay.
And I actually tried both of those. And the problem I ran into was even when I really pumped it up, even when it was like, hey, if the next 2 ticks of damage would kill it, or the next, big damage value would kill it. First of all, we ran into concerns around like, well, this actually makes Singe better at proxying, which is like, we're okay with Singe doing some amount of proxying, and at least in the current game, but we didn't necessarily want to buff that. And
I don't think that would need buffs either, anyways, to be honest with you. So.
Yeah, fair enough. And then secondarily, the problem was when the executes were at all reasonable, it actually still ran into problems where it's like, oh, actually, you still don't get this CS, right? Like you still, like, I can remember I had a version of it where it was 2 ticks of execution, right? Like checks the next 2 ticks to see if it'll kill. And I had one of the game analysis team experts, like, guys who plays a lot of Singe, send a clip to me of he's trying to farm a wave like normally with 6 minions, and he misses 3 of them with this double.
I was actually going to show you like a clip that I was looking for some before we got on call, but I totally get that. Yeah.
My mind was just blown. I was like, I can't believe that it's this bad. And so I was like, okay, what's like the most nuclear option that I can come up with, like the most extreme version? It was this, right? Which is, you know what? Minions just cannot take the kill crit. Like minions cannot take kill credit from Singe.
Okay.
And I threw that in, and my expectation was that it would like, oh man, Singe is going to be so crazy in our test. But it was like, it was surprisingly tame. We did actually some tests where it was, hey, Singe, you're not allowed to proxy. Like, see what happens when you only lane. You only lane, and it was, he does get a lot more CS, but it felt pretty reasonable. Like, I think surprisingly reasonable. And so we put that together with a couple of small nerfs, because essentially we're saying, hey, we're going to give you more gold. So we're taking away some of your base.
Okay.
We're taking away some of your base HP and some of your scaling, because we're essentially giving you the gold to compensate there.
I think it was scaling saying, HP, right? Or
yeah, it's HP per level and an AP ratio on E.
Yeah.
And the thought process was like, okay, we're going to give you extra gold. You can spend that gold however you want. You want to play tank Singed? Go ahead. You'll deal, you'll be slightly less tanky from base HP, but you can, buy the HP you're missing, basically, right? You want to be really high damage, you can buy the AP, or the, the burn effects or whatever to make up for the damage you've lost on E. That was the core idea. And then the attack speed was mostly around being able to last hit under turret, which is currently pretty painful. Obviously, I'm sure you know more than anyone else here, right?
I was going to comment on that as well. I had like a little running list in my head of like situations where this could potentially be affected.
Yeah, because the key thing here is that the new execute on the poison only works against minion damage, right? So it does not affect tower damage at all.
Yeah.
And so you still have to like either use a combination of poison plus an auto attack, or 2 auto attacks in a lot of cases to last it under turret early. And so the attack speed was something that
unless your minions are also hitting their minions while the turret's hitting them as well, right? I would assume. For that one minion at a time, right? Or
there is like some weird, like there's some weird cases you can run into where it's like, oh, your minion wave comes, crashes into the enemy minion wave, your poison is on it, and before the tower shot hits it, it dies to a minion. Okay, you get kill credit there, which I think is probably correct, right? Like otherwise it'd be very hard to get those minions.
That would matter mostly, I would say, for cannon minions when you're getting pushed in to your turret versus like
that makes sense.
Versus like your Quins, your Nars, your Teemos, things like that, right? For cannon minion, I think that would be the most relevant, because that's going to take a lot of turret shots, but also like tank your wave as well, right? So
yeah, that makes sense. And so you're more likely to have your minions crash into it because the wave is just there for longer. And then the same thing could happen on cannon waves to some of the casters as well.
Okay,
of course.
So I think like my input on the change as a whole, initially, my reaction with any change at all, usually just in life or in League in general, is kind of negative. But then I thought about it for a bit and talked with Frux for a bit, and I think it will be good. It should hopefully help more people get into the champion, which is very good in my opinion. Always love new Singed players coming in, and just make him less painful overall to play, because I think the most frustrating part of the game for this champion is always going to be like pre-first recall, first 3, 4, 5 minion waves. That is the most volatile part of the game for him, if that makes sense, where you can kind of make or break your first recall, and if you're not getting like a solid first recall to get your refill, get your boots, get an amp tome, or anything useful, right, then whenever you're back in lane, you're going to get outstatted by the enemy. And I'm talking from like a biased high elo perspective, but you can get outstatted by the enemy. League players getting better over time as well, so it happens lower and lower these days as well, on the ladder. Killed as well, And if you're not running like teleport, you can't reset your lane. But then if you have like a ghost flash setup, or sorry, if you have like a teleport ghost setup, your later part of the game in terms of team fight is a little bit weaker as well because you lack mobility, right? So you're kind of trying to balance like your mobility in your summoners with utility in summoners, while also trying to have like a not super volatile early game, while also trying to like not die and or maybe potentially look for a kill depending on how you're playing, right? So there's and let me know if I'm rambling, but there is a couple different ways to approach matchups, right? Where you can be much more aggressive on an early wave and just hard all in somebody level 1 with like a Conqueror setup, right? And in those situations, I don't think that having this buff would matter as much because you are going to generate Conqueror stacks from essentially ghosting at them level 1, which is definitely a strat. And it sounds weird, but you kind of got to do this right now a little bit to generate your AP and push the wave in, and then look for your proxy, right? And the reason why you look for proxy a lot of the time on Singed is because the early game is so volatile, right? In terms of 1v1, because his damage is mostly in scaling, and that's not really a complaint. I'm just saying like that's how the champion is, and I'm okay with that, right? But when you look for the proxy, you're looking for a lot of time to get a faster recall, a safer, not safer recall, but a faster recall, better tempo, back to your lane without teleport if you're not taking teleport, right? While the enemy laner is still pushing their wave because you're trying to use the advantage of your wave clear in the early. This would matter most when you are, in my opinion, fighting the laner on the wave for either a 1v1 or for wave prio, right? And so when you're actually behind turret, it's not going to matter at all, except for a slight DPS decrease on cannon, but if 0.05 ratio is not going to give the cannon, you're not going to get anyways, probably, right? So I doubt it would matter.
No, I mean, early game, you're talking about a couple points of damage, so it shouldn't make much of a difference.
I think in general, I am pretty positive on it because, like you said, it would help make it. Well, it's not like QOL because it is kind of a buff in my opinion. So I wouldn't call it QOL. We're essentially trading like that late game fling burst for a bit more early game stability and some squishiness, right? So yeah, I'm open to it personally. I don't know how everybody else is gonna feel because I haven't talked to a lot of people specifically, besides outside of like Reddit comments and stuff like that. My Discord server was initially kind of negative on it until I was like, I think it'll be okay, and then they started getting a bit more positive about it after that. But I like it. I think it'll be fun, and definitely will help with the feeling of minion RNG because, like you said earlier, there are a lot of moments where you run through a wave and you just get KS by your own minions, right? And if you're losing 1, 2, 3 minions per wave, 5, 6, 7 waves in a row, that adds up, right? Yeah. And so the other school of thought for Singed is like you're going to play much more defensively under your turret, play back, try and get what you can, not risk your life for proxying, right? But you kind of, the reason why I never play like that, and I am always trying to like play aggressively and get behind turret, is because you just kind of slowly lose that way. And so I think, like, my personal biased opinion, knowing that this will not buff the defensive playstyle as much, I think I like that. You know what I mean? Because like I kind of like to be, as a player, just kind of more aggressive and looking for crazier things to do. And knowing that it's not going to buff proxy, I think, in an unhealthy way is really good. If anything, like a tiny proxy nerf, right?
Sure.
So I think one thing that I am scared of is, and maybe this is just my biased perspective for playing the champion for so long and having so much experience on him, like, I'm always afraid of like any sort of small thing just breaking him and making him like 56% win rate, like pick ban, right? Because like in my mind, if I'm able in most games to have a more consistent first recall, I can like the world is my like oyster, right? I can do whatever I want at that point. I know it's not the same case for most players, where they're probably not gonna be able to have that same level of like options available to them in terms of their game. But like for me, that's sort of my fear, right? Like I feel like, oh, I have 150 extra gold after 3 waves. Like I can do whatever I want now. You know what I mean? Like I know it sounds crazy, but like that's sort of my perspective.
No, I mean I understand it. You know, I used to be good. My skills kind of fallen off these days, but you know,
it's like riding
there
a
was
bike,
a time. Yeah, I understand. You know, even like 100 gold, right? I mean, I'm the person who just took 100 gold off First Blood, right? I understand exactly what that can mean, right? Like it's actually a lot of extra snowball, right? You know, I totally understand the concern here, and yeah, I get it. It's like it can be scary, and the hope is, hey, you know what? I give you, you know, you get Okay, so you get some extra gold, and the hope is here, you know, let like put aside the win rate for for a second here, right? It's like
Yeah,
obviously
yeah,
that does matter, but
yeah.
like put aside the win rate. Ultimately, the hope for this change is that Singed players actually want to lane more, right? That there's actually a reason why you would want to be in lane rather than, hey, in this matchup, everything is about, you know, ghosting on them, getting my Conqueror stacks, pushing the wave in so that I can set up a proxy for 2 waves, and that puts me in the perfect position for the
Right.
rest of the game,
Can I pause
right?
you for a second right there?
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Sure. So, two things. Not every matchup, and this is very like one trick thought, but not every
Mhm.
matchup is one where you can run Conqueror, in my opinion. For example, like Darius,
Sure.
right? When you're playing versus Darius, his goal is to trap you in his W slow. Then when you fling him, to pull you in with E, and then stack up his passive and kill you, right? And you
Mhm.
cannot really get away without either a flash or a ghost or a phase rush. Is generally what I recommend people to take in that matchup, right? And one of my fears is that this change would kind of bind him more towards Conqueror, which I think the vast majority of players I think are okay with. Um, and I think for the vast majority of matchups that would be fine, right? But just in like taking a very popular champion like Darius or Nasus, for example, is another phase rush matchup in my opinion. Anyone that can kind of like trap you with a slow,
Mhm.
having that matchup be a little bit weaker when it's already so volatile, I think will be a bit more painful. But that being said, I am open to it, right?
Okay.
Even in that situation, just because I think like the net benefit of having more people try out a champion through a change like this is such a good thing, right? Um, the other
So
thing
hold
is,
on. What
sorry,
what
keep going, keep
can
going.
you can you answer this? This is just an interesting question for me. Is what do you think about these changes makes you more bound to Conquer than previously? Like what about them is making
The
that true
damage
for you?
nerf on E means that you're
Okay.
looking for damage elsewhere, right?
Mhm.
And that would generally come through your Conqueror stacks. Now, even
Okay.
though the ratio is being nerfed, AP is still AP, and it's still going to help you have damage, right? Especially for your poison trail, for your damage
Oh
over
yeah.
time in general, right?
Yeah, most of your damage is on Q for sure.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
yeah, that spells the ratio on Q is very pushed for
yeah.
sure. I mean that's certainly where most of your damage is coming from. I mean that's why I nerfed the E. My assumption was for the average Singe player. I mean, and hopefully, my assumption was probably for someone like yourself as well that you would much rather see an E ratio nerf than like a Q ratio nerf or a Q
Oh,
damage nerf, right?
yeah. If it's
Yeah,
between those two choices, for sure. And I don't know like where else power could even really be pulled, because I don't think about like the character in terms of like design that much. You know what I mean? Or balance. I'm
sure.
just thinking like, what can I do to like make him work as best as I can, right? So it's sort of like
Uh-huh.
a different approach, but um, I guess the ultimate maybe like the 5 stat from 65 to 60 level 2, because if you nerf the level 1, his early game becomes very like muddy in my opinion, because remember he was at 20 stats in level 1 ult for a while, and it was just like that was not it in my opinion. He got put back
Okay.
up to 30. The level 3 I think is a reward for hitting late game in my opinion, because he kind of sort of feels like I'm 16, I'm like a demon now, right? um
Sure.
Whereas level 2 I think is sort of like in the middle, and potentially pulling slots in there could be useful, but at the same time, like when you're coming out of laning phase in a lot of these matchups, like your Camille's, your Jax's, your Renekton's, like a lot of time you are down CS in general. You're usually down turret plates as well, just because like your early is not as good as theirs, but you are playing for like that 5v5, right? And so
Mhm.
I almost feel like nerfing that as well could be problematic, because when you're at 14 minutes and you want to skirmish Dragon, you want to skirmish Rift Herald, right? It can cause issues in my opinion, but so it was hard for me even to think of places to pull power from rather than E or health scaling. The armor was, I think, decreased a bit earlier this year, and then um, passive. I mean, I remember the cooldown was reduced from 10 to 8 a few years ago. And I think the speed was put from 20 to 25%. So that's maybe potentially doable, but at the same time, like we're in such a long range meta right now, in my opinion, at least for Hilo, that having lower mobility could be very painful as well, right? So I think
Mhm.
the E was probably the right call as well. Um,
It's good to hear.
just my opinion, right? I'm sure comments and Reddit or anything will maybe say differently. Minish Cap, you're an idiot, and this is not your correct take or whatever. But um, the other thing I wanted to comment on is the thing that you mentioned was one of the goals was that Singe players actually want to lane. Um, and the thing I wanted to comment on with that is the and again, this is my biased perspective, right? But
Sure.
I find that uh the margins of certain lanes are so thin already that having, even if it's like 10 15 damage early game on E, having that be a bit lower will suck a bit. But I can't imagine a world in which you're gonna have an amount of AP that would actually like decrease that much with 5%, right? So it's like,
Yeah, I mean, to get for that to be 10 damage, you'd have to have 200 AP,
yeah,
right? So
yeah,
that's like you're talking outside of laning phase for that
yeah,
for
for
that
sure.
point, right? Like, maybe I don't know what Singe builds you're cooking up these days, but unless you're going like Shadow Flame first, you're talking about like for most of laning phase, this is going to be like a 2-3 damage nerf, right?
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Um, and then I guess we can get into the list of questions that you had for me earlier. I think the first question was, let me pull it up. How much does this affect Singe's decision making slash optimality around choosing to proxy versus lane in hard slash normal slash easy matchups, right?
Yeah, and I understand, like, obviously it's not as simple as like just breaking it down into like hard versus easy matchups. I understand some hard matchups are different than others, but just
Mhm.
generally, like, your thoughts here of like, hey, are there matchups where you're imagining having this buff in and you're thinking, oh, I actually want to lane instead of playing for a proxy at this level or on this wave or whatever, right? Like,
Yes.
and generally just your thoughts around that.
So with me as a player personally, I would probably
Okay.
choose to proxy no matter what, but this would be a tool to get me there. It's fun for me. It's fun for me, right? Like this is what I
All
do.
right, all right.
But there is a school of thought for Singed where you want to try and lane more because it's less dangerous to set a jungler, and you can kind of predict the enemy laner's damage a bit more easily because you know their cooldowns, you know their summoners, you know what items they have, right? Whereas junglers are in fog and you can't really predict that as easily, right? So
Sure.
I think that it does certainly change some matchups where knowing that you're able to like trade your HP bar to walk towards the wave and get more last hits in general with poison without stopping to like right click auto and then take 3 extra autos from like a Camille or something, right? I think that matters a lot for sure
Hmm.
because you're gonna risk or have less chance of getting all in. You're gonna have on average more gold, and you're less pressured in that scenario to go behind turret and try and get one wave of perfect CS to try and like maybe hit your boot spike, hit your refill, hit your amp tome, right? Blasting
Hmm.
wand in particular is like a bit of a pain point sometimes if you are rushing relics because it's very hard sometimes to save up that 850, right? And this would go a
Hmm.
long way towards doing that without having to get a wave and then die to the jungler, give up first blood feats, and now your team's mad at you, right? So,
Hmm.
yeah, I think it'll definitely help in that regard. It probably won't like completely flip matchups in my opinion, but it'll help for sure, and it would, in my opinion, decrease that need to be like, if I don't proxy this wave, I can't recall, I can't get my item spike. What do I do? You know what I mean? Like she recalls for Sheen. If I don't have blasting wand, I'm cooked, right?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So yeah, I think in that regard, it definitely will help. You will probably hear different opinions and comments, but that's just my take. What do you think?
So I will tell you straight up, it's like I used to be a Singe player,
Oh,
we're talking
really?
like 10 years ago,
Yo,
right?
that's
Like we're
dope.
talking a long time ago.
I was also a Singe player
Um,
10 years ago.
but I kind of put the champ down, long time ago.
Yeah.
Again, my skill has long since, gone out the window. And so my perspective, like when I used to play him back in like season 5 into like Maokai top and stuff, right? That was the hot pick back in the day. You picked Singed into Maokai and you just kind of destroyed him, right? There's nothing he can do to you. And my recollection of the pain points of a lot of them was, damn, this sucks when I feel like I have an advantage and I want to press it and I'm in the lane, right? Maybe you don't want to set up a proxy. The enemy jungler's strong, and you're just playing normally. You're just farming, and it's like, damn, it sucks that I missed 2 CS out of this wave. That just feels
Yeah,
terrible, right?
absolutely.
In situations where I couldn't set up a proxy back in the day, I always felt bad about that. And this was something like, we have some Singe players, who are actually currently good, and unlike me, who play Singe a lot, and I spent a lot of time talking with them around, hey, what do you need to feel like you have agency on the champion? And a lot of what this came down to was like, hey, if I just had more gold, like if I actually could get these last hits, that would make me feel like I would want to play more Singed because I'd feel more confident in going into a game and not feeling like everything was based on, oh, did the jungler come to counteract my proxy? Did I get this wave in at exactly the right time and to get past the turret? Did I get this? These like small timing windows, which I understand. Like some Singe players, I'm sure actually like that the champion is a lot about these small timing windows, and the goal here is I'm actually making those a little less important because if you fail them, well, you have a little bit more of a backup plan, right? Like you have a little bit more of a fallback pattern. But obviously, like you were talking about earlier, the defensive, like sit under your turret and farm, it's like that's not really changed that much, right? It's like, yeah, you'll probably get a slightly more farm in those cases, but it's not going to be a huge difference, right? And so the goal was more about, hey, those really tight timing windows that sometimes you're going to fail, and sometimes that's not even inside your control.
We'll make it a little bit wider, right?
Yeah, we'll widen those windows a bit, and we'll also make it so if you miss the window, it's not quite as punishing, right? Obviously, still sometimes that's going to suck, and you're going to die because the enemy jungler, showed up at the right time or whatever, right? But the hope is that, hey, Singed is more fun because when you miss this window in the Quinn matchup or whatever, the game isn't immediately over, right? Like that, because that's my recollection is there's a lot of champions you just play against them and you're just like, oh, I missed this window. It's over. It's over. We lost.
I think just this morning I played a game versus I forgot. I think it was Timo, but I missed like the first 4 cannons. I was like, man, I would rather be anywhere else right now. And it's that's one thing. I also want to mention. This would technically save mana as well because you're not as pressured to last hit a cannon with fling as well, and that might potentially have a greater impact on win rate than just gold itself, because you would have more longevity on the map as well, right? But
yeah, that could be the case, and I suspect that actually is probably than that's going to be more mastery skewed for like someone who's really invested, which I actually think is fine, right? Like I'm actually totally happy with making it so that really good players have more optimizations that they can do with Singe that make them better than the average player, right? Like I think that's fine, and it's good for champions to have fun. I think especially if they're fun optimizations, right? It's like I would hate to add an optimization where you're like, well, I really hate that I can't fling this cannon, right? It's like, well, you still can, it's just you might want to save mana sometimes, right? So
exactly.
I'm totally cool with having adding some optionality to the champion that can result in some skillful play. I think that's actually good.
Man, I'm just thinking about being like that cool guy that never looks at his minions and just knowing it's gonna get the last hit. Like, because so many times, like I remember I get ganked as I'm like, whoa, sorry, my cat just went crazy. Sometimes I'm like looking at the wave as I'm trying to walk into river to see if my poison last hits a cannon. I see it get executed or chaos by my minion, and then all of a sudden a kindred's on me, right? Because I walked in a river, and I'm just like, man, like, why did I do that? Now my cannon's gone too, and this sucks. Like, so I'm just thinking about, man, I don't have to worry about that ever again. That sounds awesome, actually, kind of. So, it is exciting.
I mean, I hope it sounds awesome.
I like it. Yeah, like after I thought about it for more than 2 seconds, I think I definitely like it. And it sounds good to me personally. Like I said, the comments might say something different to you, but me personally, I think it'll hopefully be a good change. I think you're. I hope I answered that question.
Oh no, that's pretty good. I think that was a very solid answer. Thank you.
Your second question was from a personal preference standpoint. So there's gonna be some bias here for me. Is there a place you'd rather lose damage than E ratio? Not saying this will change, but I wanted to get a read on your thoughts here for doing a small damage nerf. I just don't know if there are a lot of places to lose damage from, right? So
he doesn't really have many. Yeah, I mean it's Q and E, right? So it's like I could theoretically nerf his base AD, but that just does not, like, first of all, that would make last hitting harder, which I'm not here to do, and how much is that really going to do, right? You get in an auto when you fling, and a couple here and there maybe, especially if you're running Conqueror, I assume. So it's pretty much Q and E, right?
Yeah, I got you for sure, and I do agree with that as well. I will say because you asked from a personal preference standpoint, I am glad that we're, as much fun as I had trying out the Wild Rift rework, I am glad that we're not in that because man, I have watched that get nerfed like 4 times now ever since it released. I'm just like, I think I'd rather live in desktop for now when it comes to Singe, because it was definitely fun on day one. I played it before the hotfix, but it's definitely gotten a little bit hit. So.
Yeah, so interesting fact is I actually used to work on Wild Rift. I did that for a couple of years.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, and one of the things I was looking at when that list came in for Wild Rift was I was looking specifically at the W line. I thought was actually pretty cool around allies can fling people into your goop and root them. I didn't end up putting that in because it was kind of like, well, it was kind of complicated, and my first
There is
version of
one
it was.
champion that can actually, I don't know if it's a bug, but there's one that can actually do that with you right now. If
Oh, really?
Alistar pulverizes in goo, it will actually root. I don't know if it's intentional. It's been that way since season 7. So
That's really bizarre. I did not know that.
yeah.
Okay, well, I'm sure that that's not intended, but that's extremely weird.
I just got
have nothing
singed
to say
nerf,
about
boys.
yeah, that one I thought was actually pretty cool, but ended
Yeah.
up not putting that in because my initial implementation was like pretty wonky, and we ended up just kind of saying like, well, do we even want to add this line? Like, is this
Mhm.
like how much is this really doing? So I
Yeah.
ended up not putting it in. But I thought it was cool conceptually. But yeah, I would generally agree. It's like, yeah, the Wild Rift works pretty wild. I think especially like the R on allies.
Well,
thing
that's
seems
intentional,
like,
right? Like, because it's meant
yeah,
to be more
yeah.
of a faster game. So
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's totally fine for Wild Rift. It's just,
yeah.
hey, for PC, I look at a lot of those changes and I say like, I just don't think this is quite. I don't think this is quite for us.
Yeah, gotcha, for sure. I totally agree. It could be fun on paper, but I think for desktop, maybe paper is where it stays for now. That's up to you guys though. That's just my because you asked personal preference. That's my personal preference, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So I think your next question was, is there anything about the list that conceptually seems off to you? Parentheses, letting Singe get more gold without minion RNG in exchange for a bit of HP damage. You can spend the gold to make up the difference. I mean, I think you kind of said it perfectly, right? Like, yeah, you're going to lose a little bit of value in your kit and your HP scaling, but I think having the slightly more stable early, losing a bit of like, we're talking like late game, like a little bit of single target, right? In exchange for having wider timings for your power spikes, I think is a good thing, and it will hopefully get more people in the champion and increases player rate, and people will, and this is just me again being a one trick, but hopefully get people to understand how much fun he is, because I just like to share it about this character. So
Yeah, sounds good.
do you have any questions for me, or
Yeah, so I have another one. This is
Cool.
just like I didn't put this in my initial post because I didn't consider it as important, but
Sure.
it's something interesting that people theorized, and one person played it one game in a playtest. It looked horrible, so just wanted to get your initial just
I'm curious.
gut check. People were talking about full tank singed, right? So because like
Okay.
look, if you think about it, it's like, well, normally one of the problems, I mean, among several, I'm sure, with tank singed is last hitting is really hard, pushing is hard, right? Because your poison does no damage because it's mostly ratio driven, right?
Or Leandry's driven.
Right, or Leandry's driven, right? Like burn effects, right?
Yeah.
So the idea was like, hey, well, if we're making it way easier to get gold if you're building tank, maybe this is now a good build, right? It's like, I look at this and I look at the kit and I'm like, well, what do you do if you're a tank exactly? Like your poison does no damage because
Yeah,
it's all
exactly.
ratio. But some people were theorizing, hey, maybe it's like this is a real, like actually a bigger buff to tanks, like a much more significant buff to tank singe, which is probably true. But my thought process on that was like, well, tank singe is probably so much worse than just like playing singe in the regular way with a bunch of AP that I don't know if it's really relevant that it's buffed more. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
So normally in a standard build, you are going to buy at least, in my opinion, at the very least one tank item, and that's usually going to be Deadman's versus AD comps or Abyssal Mask versus AP comps. They tend to just be the most efficient straight up armor or straight up MR item that you can get on him for what he wants to do in the game. And the more tank items you build for, generally, you are going to lower your damage, and there's a threat of being drain tanked. Legit, like, and I'm talking versus like Challenger, Grandmaster, Master players, right? There's a very legitimate threat of getting drain tanked by like your Ravenous Hydra Camille's, your Grasp Jax, Sundered Sky Jarvan, Bloodthirster late game ADC, right? That can definitely happen, even with the Grievous Wounds on your ultimate, because your just output is so much lower on poison. That is a problem that can happen. But I will say, for scenarios where you are solo frontline, because high elo players love to pick 4 carries with no engage, I'll say for that scenario, I think it could be good, because if I need to have access to more expensive tank items like Jack Show, Warmogs, Randuins, things like that, right? And I'm going to be lacking gold normally. If I can find some of that now, as I'm just like hard pushing waves, it's easier to get to it, and maybe I can sort of off-roll that front line for my team. It's not ideal, because I do think that your overall impact will be lower, but at least it's an option, right? Like I think from a personal standpoint, Singed is best played as the AP bruiser. I think he's labeled as a specialist. That's fine. It's whatever.
Yeah, I mean the role definitions are whatever.
Yeah,
I mean Singe does not fit well into traditional roles. For sure.
Yeah, for sure. The way that I see him generally is as an AP bruiser. I think this helps him get there for sure. But if he needs to like off tank, totally he can. It's always been possible, but like you said, because it's so much harder to get gold, you're very bound to Leandries, and he still will be in my opinion, especially if going full tank. But even with Leandries, like if you're not scaling that flat AP value, you will get KS by minions as the minions themselves get higher and higher HP levels, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, I'm excited. I think it'll be good. The I think second biggest pain point for Singed outside of losing minions to RNG is probably those range matchups, right? And don't get me wrong, I don't want champions to have no weaknesses. I don't want champions to like just kind of be pickable blind everywhere. I understand that there is a choice you make when you main a champion. You're accepting the character's weaknesses as well as their strengths, right? And so as much as I would love it, I am glad that we are not adding the damage from W that Wild Earth did, because I think that would actually break the champion. Because like normally when you see like a Teemo or a Quinn or a Vayne top lane, you're like, man, what do I do now? This is challenging, right? I have to kind of think about this. If I could just center a turret and max W and take mana flow ban and just pop waves, like it would trivialize it, right? So like that sort of leads me into like my last point though, is like there are players I think who will see this as sort of trivializing the champion in terms of like like making him easier to play, right? But you mentioned that in your play testing that wasn't really the case whenever you guys were testing it like internally, right?
No, because like there's still almost all the skill tests are identical, right? Like this is one of the things that's interesting about last hitting, right? It's like last hitting we traditionally consider to be like a pretty important skill test for most champions, right? Like that are laners at least. It's, hey, are you in the right position? Are you in attack range? Do you have a spell up? Are you going to get traded on, right? Like there's so many things that go into this. And with Singed, when we take away the ability for you to like miss the CS to minions, we actually don't really change that skill test that much, because the skill test you're asking from Singed is, well, you have to have stood on or very close to the minion within the last 3 seconds, right?
Yeah.
So the reality is like
volatile inherently, right?
Yeah, it's like with Singed, that mini game, like that skill test is a lot more about positioning than most other champions. Because most other champions.
Thank you for saying this. People don't realize that. They really don't get that. Sorry, I'm.
I understand. Yeah, but it's like it's the skill test is now it is easier, right, in some ways, but it's still asking you for a lot of this positional gameplay around. Okay, did you get to the minion? Were you there at the right time? Did you spend the right amount of mana? Right? Did you leave your poison in the right location? Did you let the minion wave come to you, poison it as you come, as it comes into your turret or whatever? Right? Did you auto attack the right number of times? How much damage did you take in response for all of this? Right? And so you still have to make all of these all of these decisions that are involved in like the last hitting process. Although obviously now in a lot of cases you're not really last hitting it yourself.
Well, I mean, you should be auto in my opinion for DPS,
spell.
but yeah.
Yeah, but you don't have that range spell, right? And to be clear, I think it's actually good that there are some champions that have those good ranged tools for last hitting, right?
Yeah.
I just don't think Singed should
be one of them.
I don't think he should be
one of them, yeah.
Like when you pick Singed, you're opting into this sharp experience that is really, really different based on your matchup, right? It's like we have champions that are relatively matchup agnostic, right? It's like
you're not picking Singed to be an all-rounder, right? That's
you're not like when you pick Singed top, you're kind of saying like I'm picking like the opposite of Gragas top, right? It's like you're not going to be able to do everything, right? You're not going to
feel magic damage, but one of us does it in a very different way.
Yeah, and so it's like yes, top lane has a lot of sharp matchups, and Singed is one of the sharpest, of these champions. And the intent with this
is that shown in stats, by the way, or is that just?
Yes, it is. Yeah,
okay. I thought so. I was curious.
So I think my recollection, I haven't looked at this data in quite some time, but my recollection from looking at this in the past is the sharpest champions are like Singed, Teemo, and Tryndamere, right? Which is like unsurprising if you think about their patterns, right? It's like, okay, these champions have really, really sharp mechanics, right? It's like Singed and Tryndamere both have no range whatsoever. Teemo has a blind, right? A very powerful anti-attacker tool, right? And it's like, okay, but he doesn't have any other tools. Okay, he has movement speed, right? But no CC, right? And, shrooms take a while to arm, right? If you're all spell-based, you can just kind of do whatever you want to Teemo outside of getting attacked by him, right? So the thing is, it's like we have these very sharp champions, and the goal of this is not to say that Singed is suddenly a super matchup agnostic champion.
You don't want
like,
him to wash
you
lanes,
just blind pick.
Yeah,
we're not saying you're going to wash every lane. We're saying that sometimes you will be able to lane in a way that you wouldn't have been able to before without proxying, right? And so
But
Yeah,
if you want to,
like
that's still an option.
yeah, probably like in this list, I guess theoretically proxying is like very slightly nerfed. Right? It's like theoretically in a world where you somehow proxy every wave, which I know is not actually possible. You
Very
can't
difficult,
literally
but yeah.
proxy every like literally proxying every wave for the laning phase is like not feasible, right? Someone will come to interrupt you at some point. You're gonna
Mana
have to
constraints,
base, right?
jungler, mid lane support,
Yeah,
especially support these days.
yeah, support these days. Yeah, mana, of course. So it's like it's not possible to proxy every wave. But imagine if you could, right? Like theoretically, if you proxied every wave, you are just nerfed by 5% ratio on E, which is it's a nerf. It's not a huge one, but it's a small nerf, and then 3 HP per level, right? So yeah, you're level 9. You're missing roughly 18 HP. It's actually slightly less than that, but whatever. You're missing a little bit of HP and a small amount of ratio on E. Okay, but let's suppose you farm 3 waves in lane and you got 6 extra CS because of this. It's like, well, 6 extra CS, that's like 20 gold per CS on average, right? That's like 180 gold. We turn that into health, that's like 75 health, right?
Yeah.
Roughly speaking, right? So it's like, okay, so if you spent that extra gold on a ruby crystal, right, assuming you didn't have enough originally for it, it's like you basically got more than your HP back. Or you could buy an amp tome, right? And that's going to give you more than the damage.
This would be more
missing.
relevant, like, well, as a comment on that, actually, this would be more relevant even after you bought that amp tome, because generally you're going to buy the amp tome first. Not always, but generally you buy it first.
Sure.
Then as you level up and that health decrease becomes noticeable, then you have the ruby crystal a bit sooner, and then you're a bit better off, right?
Yeah. And the fact that it can give you like gold, especially in the first couple of levels, I think ends up being pretty relevant. Is something that we noticed in testing for sure was, hey, if this gets you like 3 last hits on in the first 2 waves, which is actually like pretty realistic, right? That happens like a very real amount of the time. That can be really big for your first base, right? Like hitting your Dark Seal or your Amp Tome or whatever, right? Like where normally you might have had to buy boots or something like that because you didn't have enough gold. That can end up being pretty big.
The legendary refill potion plus nothing recall. That's one of my favorites. I think. Yeah,
that's a classic. Yeah,
or even the recall single red potion. Ooh.
Oh,
no more, man. No more.
Recall. Yeah.
What was that? Sorry.
The poverty recall.
Yeah. Man. So I'm glad to hear you say that, honestly, because I also don't want to play a Singe where he just like auto washes lanes and because that becomes boring for me too, right? You know what I mean? Because I'm not playing League because I want an easy game. I'm playing because I want a challenging game. But if we're able to minimize like needless frustration, I think that is overall a good thing. And like I said, before I thought about it for 2 seconds, I was a little bit upset, but then it I think it'll be good. I'm optimistic. I'm positive. There will be a potential. I will tell you my personal opinion. There's a potential for it to be a much bigger spike in win rate in higher elo than probably what you expect because of players like me who can like hella optimize it, right? Because for me, 150 gold matters a lot more than someone playing in gold, where like 150 gold, what do I buy? I'm thinking, bro, 150 gold, I take one more wave, I have boots, I have amp tome, right? Like that, and I can change that into a much more favorable early game. And in my opinion, because the early game is the most volatile part, if I can make that more stable for myself, then the rest of my game is smoother, right? Because it's sort of like, sorry, keep going.
Yeah, so I just wanted to like bring this up here. It's like I can understand how you'd think like, oh, hey, I got a little extra gold, that's going to go really far for me. But here's a point to consider.
Okay.
Think about how bad the average lower MMR player is at last hitting, right? How much extra gold they're going to be making. So I truly like, we've never put like, obviously this is the most powerful execute we've ever made, right? Like we've never put anything like, I actually like when I looked at the execute, when we put it on Malzahar, for example, I took a look at that data, which unfortunately like, came with some other changes. It wasn't pure isolated. So, it wasn't like in isolation, but it's like, it actually was surprisingly not super skewed, right? Between MMRs. And it's possible that this execute is so powerful that it displays a skew that's stronger one way or the other. But my estimation based on the data that we have and my understanding of like, yes, you're going to optimize that gold better, but the lesser skilled players are going to be getting more gold, right? Mm-hmm. So in some ways, it may be kind of self-balancing here, right? Where the worse you are at last hitting, the more gold you get, but the better you are at last hitting.
Them, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So it's kind of both sides. Both sides are getting a powerful thing out of this, right? It's like the people who aren't good at last hitting are getting more gold. The people who are good at last hitting are getting more power from each gold that they're getting because they're getting more optimal resets, and they're buying better, and they're understanding what the tempo and the base timings and these things better. And so yeah, you could be right, like I'm not saying like, oh, you're wrong, right? But it's just, well, in lower MMRs this is going to give you more gold, and we for sure know gold is quite powerful, right? Like I don't think anyone's disputing that, right? It's just like, if I told you that in lower MMRs this is giving you twice as much gold as it's going to give or it's going to give them twice as much gold as it's going to give you, well, how much is that skew, right? Is that worth as much as the tempo gain you're getting? Maybe, I don't know, right? It might not line up exactly, but my estimation is, my guess is it's probably close, at least.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Gotcha. But yeah, I think I am hopefully, or cautiously optimistic. Do you have any more questions for me? I think I kind of got through my whole list for you.
Yeah, my last question would be just like, and not making any promises about this, but just like wish list, Singed, Singed change. Is there one thing that you wish for on Singed that you could have? Like, you're just, this is magical, Christmas land. You can wish for anything, right? What would you want? And like, this is, considering, talking like the stuff we were before, where it's like, hey, you wouldn't actually want the range damage on W. I'm not talking about, what do you want in like, your dream when you are trying to become the best player in the world, who's the best Singed one. I'm saying like, actual load into the game. You're the most excited to play Singed because of this.
Man, that is a very open-ended question. Like, could you narrow it down just slightly? Like, give me a scenario, right? And then maybe I can build off of that a little bit.
Okay, you just, you load it up. It's your first solo queue game of the day. You're laning against, what's the most common matchup that you play against right now?
Like melee or range?
Melee.
Camille.
You're laning against Camille, and you see that Camille has grasp, just like every other Camille that you've seen over the past 5 years. The Camille has grasp. You load into the game. Your jungler is, you don't even know who they are. You've never seen them before in your entire life, and they're playing Jarvan or something. The enemy jungler is playing Rek'Sai because they hate themselves. And you're looking at this top lane matchup, and you've just seen the patch notes for this new change you're playing. What is it that you want?
Okay, so this is again a very biased perspective. For champions like that specifically, it would be amazing if Fling overrided every dash, because you also mentioned Jarvan. Like just as a rule, like if Fling could just override every dash when casted during an enemy's dash, right? Because Camille can actually Q2, E2, ignore Fling.
Mm-hmm.
E1, actually, if you ground her on the wall, she can actually kind of like glitch out of it and then complete the E. Actually, it's very weird.
Interesting.
Yeah, and then Jarvan can also for Jarvan, it's a timing test. If you fling him,
he can ignore it, because he just has to cast Q,
yeah. So with him, it's a little bit different. But it used to be, I remember back in the old days, like it was much more common before dashes changed to where you could fling people out of their dash and punish them for dashing near you or dashing at an inappropriate time. That would be very cool. I think as like a wider, as like just that would be like matchup specific, but like just in general. Oh, that's such a hard question. That's like asking a kid what he wants for Christmas. It's like, hold on. Okay, give me like 2 seconds to think about it. I think maybe having some sort of reward for like additional reward for hitting later stages of the game could be cool. Similar to how Cassiopeia, I don't know if she still does have this, but she used to gain rewards at certain mana intervals. And she still might. I just don't pay attention to her kit that much.
No, it's stacks of her passive when she had the stacking like poison enemies to get stacks thing.
Like that could be really cool. Where hey, maybe I'm at a certain amount of health or a certain amount of movement speed or a certain amount of X stat, and I gain additional reward, right? Or maybe no, Dash Fling would be too broken. Dash Fling would be crazy. Maybe just a shield on Fling instead. Could be cool because like he has a shield, right? You know what I mean? But I could also see a world
I have always thought that was strange. Yeah.
Champion
champion who's carrying around big shield doesn't have a shield.
Yeah. I can see how that would not totally break in, but be potentially hard though, because like if you're flinging with a shield up, less minion damage, less trade back damage, better in team fights as well. You can, I don't know if it'd work on monsters, but you could potentially like tank monsters way easier as well. The champion lacks innate sustain, so maybe do you remember that old no, we have it back in the game. It's not Taste of Blood, Absorb Life, right? Because he lacks innate sustain, one of the things that he wants to do a lot is get that proxy to get that recall and get your health back, right? Some form of sustain, but I could also see how that would just like break him, you know what I mean? So it's hard, but there is sort of like a laundry list that is always kind of running in the back of my mind about, and this would be cool, or people like suggest like on my streamer comments like, hey Mitch, what do you think if Singed had like this mechanic, or like some sort of like additional reward, some additional scaling? Because I don't think anyone's really, personally, I don't think anyone's playing Singed to have like a hyper powerful early game. Like you kind of want to be like that area of effect, late game, run around, disrupt team fights, spread AoE damage, right? Because I always tell people I think Singed is one of the best team fighters in the game, if not like the best, if he has resources, right? But if he doesn't have them, it can be very, very hard for him. But I have a hard time thinking of many champions who are able to put down that much AoE damage that quickly. There probably are some that can compete, especially like when you ask certain players, right? But as far as the early game goes, like sustain or maybe that shield, that fling shield dash, I think would break him completely. I'm trying to think. Walls are like his biggest enemy, and I think Wild Rift kind of nullified that by letting him dash through walls. So as fun as that would be, like I don't think we should go in that direction personally. I don't know. I think some of that stuff could be cool though, potentially. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thanks for answering. That's nice.
Yeah, no worries.
Good to hear.
But yeah, if that's all the questions you have for me, that's all the questions I have for you. And thank you so much for. I know this is where you wanted to be on a Friday night, is talking with a random Singed one trick. So, but yeah,
no, I mean,
I appreciate your
thanks
time,
for chatting. I mean, this is fun. This is super useful for me. So absolutely, thanks for chatting, and thanks for having an open mind here. I'm sure, I know it's very easy. Your one trick, you put thousands of hours into your champion. Some guy who used to play this champion 10 years ago comes in and makes some potentially big changes to your champion. I'm sure that can be scary. And
well, I always tell people like never to be afraid of asking for, and this is like players who ask me like on comments and on stream, like never be afraid to like give your idea about what to do or how to itemize, and never be afraid to like ask about it either, because some of the best ideas that I've ever had playing this game came from somebody 3,000 LP lower than me who just had an idea, right? So I don't know if you remember. Sure. This is totally an aside, but I don't know if you remember like the Z0 meta back in like competitive play and stuff like that. But I started doing that like 6 months before in solo queue, because someone I saw, like I loaded into a normal game and it was like a gold Singed player. I was like, this guy's an idiot. The man buys ZZ Rot first item and just plops it down mid lane. I was like, oh my, like my brain was broken. Like I couldn't believe it. And then I started doing that, and I think in the span of like 2 weeks, I got like rank 43 or something doing that. It was wild. But yeah, I try to tell people like never be afraid of like giving their opinion, because like especially when you're talking to a one trick, like we get set in our ways. Like we build patterns, and one of the things I always try and do is like break out of those patterns to like try and keep my mind open, because like how else do you improve when you play the same character for so long, right? You have to be open to ideas, you know what I mean? So
sure, yeah. I mean, you got to change things up, and yeah, it obviously especially when you're talking thousands of hours deep into a champion, I'm sure it can be hard to change.
Yeah. And I just don't deal well with change in general personally. So I've been that way since I was a kid. So it is what it is. But yeah, I think this will be, fingers crossed, good for the champion and good for the player base. So
great. I mean, I love to hear that. Thank you very much. I mean, and yeah, thanks for talking, and yeah, thanks for taking out the time as well.
Yeah, and super appreciate your time, and I will catch you later.
All right. See ya.